My name is Hennie Heymans. I'm the Managing Director for DHL, mostly the SADC region and then all of the Indian Ocean Islands. So I'm going to try and quickly sketch the background against which I'll be giving the recommendations just referred to. Africa is in a wonderful position right now in the world, and it's demanding quite an interesting position at the table when it starts talking about growth. If you look at some of the statistics that's been released by the World Bank, it is predicting that Africa will grow between now and 2040 at an average GDP rate of about 6% per annum. What does that mean for us from a transport perspective? It roughly indicates that volumes will increase between 6 and 8 times over that same period, and more so perhaps for the landlocked countries. And we will see an increase in those volumes up to 14 times. It also means that GDP on average will increase sixfold. So it just gives the indication that this continent is going to become a very powerful growth area for the rest of the world. But as we all know, there are some significant challenges on this continent to improve the intra-regional trade. And just a little bit more statistics that I want to give on that. If you look at the intra-regional trade on the continent at the moment, it is as low as 12% at the moment. If you compare that to the likes of Europe and Asia, in Europe, for example, it's as high as 70%, which means two things for us in Africa. It means that we've got to try and remove as many of those trade barriers as we can, and we've got to boost the infrastructure to enable the free flow of goods and services across the continent. So, Mr. Chair, back to the question. I think there are three probably main challenges for us on the continent. And if I was in the betting industry, I would have probably taken a bet that one of the slides we most often see is the corruption slide that goes up on many of these conferences. And I think it's one of the major challenges that we face on the continent. The second one that we face, as we've already heard from the other guest speakers, is the lack of infrastructure. And specifically the difference between the infrastructure in your main centres, so the Maputos and the Lagoses of this world, and the Kairos, etc., versus where the rural areas are. And in many instances, the development and the mining activities, for example, if you take Mozambique, happens in the rural areas, which means that there's an absolute lack of infrastructure. Towns like Beira and Tet, for example, where all of these massive deposits have been found, have got virtually no infrastructure. And then the last one that I think that we need to address from a challenges perspective is the issue around customs and the flow of goods through customs. So in terms of making it attractive to invest in infrastructure, my three recommendations would be that as a continent, and perhaps through the African Union, we've got to show serious intent to get rid of corruption and to deal with corruption. And by dealing with corruption, making it far more attractive and less risky for international investors to come to the continent and to invest. The African Union has given the rubber stamp to about 7 projects across the continent that they perceive as important to boost the competitiveness of the continent. And I think it's an imperative that those 7 projects are accelerated because that'll show to the private investor community the seriousness of governments across the continent in getting the infrastructure to a reasonable level. And then finally, I think what's an important miss for us in some instances is for Africa as a whole to provide a universally accepted legal framework in which they can operate and in which they can call upon should the need arise. So that, Mr. Chair, would be my 3 recommendations to accelerate it. The key is to get all of these different pieces of the puzzle to come together and to form the picture. And again, I've got to reiterate what I've said earlier on. I think Africa is in an incredibly strong position right now. The eyes of the world are certainly on Africa. This is the last frontier, if you want. This is where most of the mineral reserves are. This is where the likes of Asia are turning to in terms of their mineral requirements and the raw materials. I think perhaps one last thing that I'll add to that is I would like to see more value-added services to take place on the continent, and it links on to the skill set that's just been mentioned. I think if we can add more of the value add to some of those products before we export them, absolutely in their raw format, just simply to re-import them in their final product, I think that'll be a nice add-on to the competitiveness of this continent. In summary, for me and for us from a DHL perspective, we've been operating on this continent for just over 30 years. and we've seen enormous improvement over this period. We've seen economy stabilize, we've seen the number of democracies more than double over the last couple of years. We have seen a massive improvement in infrastructure. So as far as we are concerned, this continent is certainly on the up, it is certainly growing, it is certainly improving on a daily basis. The returns on this continent are certainly strong, and I think the time is right for investors to come in and put some money into this continent. So thank you very much.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.